you supply it at a required rate to the rural poor, to the urban poor? Why should it be limited only to paddy and wheat? It's not clear. Why can't you sort of expand that procurement? Why can't we expand NFSA? These things should be done. The problem is that somehow there seems to be a national consensus that the burden of providing cheap food should be put on the farmer.
But that brings us to the resources question, right? Because effectively you're saying increase MSP so that farmers get more money, but increase public distribution and increase subsidy, both of which are costs to government. So,
okay, just before that, I just want to add to what Yogendra said. You know, another aspect of the trade policy of this government has been very anti-farmer, which is to say that in periods when global prices have risen, export bans have been put in place. And when the global price is very low, you have continued to allow imports. So it's been even worse. In other words, they've added to the fact that global prices have been low. Yeah, the resources issue, I'm sure Pinaki will have a lot more to say on that. But, you know, I mean, there are some obvious things that can be done. There is a wealth tax, which we do not have anymore. There is an inheritance tax, which we do not have, and which most countries in Asia have at the moment. There are possibilities like a turnover tax on large companies. Now, if you actually give reasonable estimates of decent enforcement of those, you could raise up to 5 or 6% of GDP just on those. Then there is the other aspect of all the various concessions that are given and exemptions that are given on income tax. If you remember, the Kelkar committee had recommended a reduction in the corporate tax rate and a removal of all exemptions. We reduced the corporate tax rate and kept all the exemptions. So there's a clear case.
Mr. Jaitley had announced right at the beginning that he's going to reduce the tax rate but remove all consumptions within exemptions within 4 years.
Yeah, but we still have all of them. So, I mean, there's a lot, even if you keep half those exemptions, you're giving away 6-7% of GDP, keep 3%. You can raise quite a lot of money if you really have the political will.
Okay, so approximately how much is the tax revenue of the government going to be? I mean, estimated?
It's together around 16-17% of GDP that we collect as taxes now.
Okay. So how do you improve that? How do you increase that?
Well, it's difficult. Overnight it will not become 20%. But certainly I think if we have to look at the bulk of the taxes that are coming to both the levels of government is GST. Now GST has to stabilize. It hasn't yet stabilized. And GST also doesn't have a universal coverage because there are a lot of things which are still out. Electricity duty is a service which is out of GST. Then you have petroleum products which are out of GST, so cascading continues. You have alcohol which is out of GST. That also creates a lot of problem in terms of, you know, this illicit liquor trade and all kinds of activities which actually evade taxes, excise duty evasion. So I think there is a need to reform GST. I think the GST that we had to, I think to be fair to the GST Council and to all the levels of governments, I think GST we had in July's 1st, 2017 and the GST today is different. And the one that we have today is certainly certainly an improved one. But I think we need to further reform this. I think the 28% rate in GST eventually has to go. So we should get to a standard rate of 18%. And then I think...
So that's a reduction in resources, right?
That's on the resources side, right?
But that's a reduction.
No, just reduction. Increase in rate cannot, because does not necessarily increase your tax revenue. In fact, one of the reasons why there is a shortfall of 1 lakh crore in GST is the complicated GST design. So now if we simplify, probably we will get the kind of revenue that we are thinking of, because in VAT we had only 2 rates, we had a very good revenue collection, but we had 6-7 different rates in GST, complicated GST structure, gave us a revenue which is actually much less. So probably simplification would give us, it's not only additional taxes, and simplification of the GST structure can certainly give us more revenue. And if that happens with an universal application of coverage, we can also have a lower rate because a lot of things are outside GST and we are not talking about it. Now there is an issue, because the issue is now that in the GST that 70% of the state's revenue come from GST, and states have no control over that revenue because GST Council has to decide. Then the state has lost their fiscal autonomy. Center has lost, but the relative loss of fiscal autonomy is more for states vis-a-vis center. Look at Kerala's case. So they wanted to impose a 2% cess, And for that, GST Council had to decide whether that would be allowed or not.
Yeah.
This would not have happened if there was no GST. So for simplification of the tax structure, we have given up our fiscal autonomy. So for tax harmony, fiscal autonomy is given up. So in this context, I think convinced states
You seem
bringing
to be
other
arguing that.
products.
You seem to be arguing that.
Yeah.
No, you seem to be arguing that the way to increase resources is through indirect taxes.
On the direct tax side, I think there are three issues that is very important. I think if I certainly don't favor a very high income tax rate across the globe, but I feel at the present juncture, given the level of income inequality and kind of research that is going on, that says that there is a case for increasing income tax rate, both at the personal level and the corporate income tax level. And if we look at our effective income tax rate, given all the exemptions that are there, even in the personal income tax rate, even the peak rate comes down to 24-25%. So even if we keep our effective tax rate at 30, I think we'll get a lot of revenue. So there is a need for rationalization of exemption. And fiscal policy has become ineffective. You have to understand that. Just India cannot increase its rates for corporate income, because then there is this issue of capital will fly away where the rate is lower. So you always be looking at rates of other competing countries which is looking for the same capital and fix your rate around that. So the ability of the government to have an independent sovereign tax policy is very limited. And that is why, that brings me to the last point, where I said the center competing with the states in the functional domain of the states, which is on the expenditure. So you appear to be more redistributive because you can't do much on the taxes side. That's the larger political economy of globalization.
But given that
Certainly you
GST
can do wealth tax and inheritance tax.
Well,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, wealth tax and inheritance tax.
But I don't know how much revenue we'll collect. I'm not too sure.
So, I'll take a few last words because I think we have to. Let me get. No, then we throw it out.
No, in terms of GST, I'm quite in agreement with what Pinaki ji was saying. Has mentioned you have to increase the ambit, reduce the amount of GST that is being charged. Whether it's petroleum, whether it is alcohol that he was talking about, we've also spoken about the real estate, which is again not in the ambit of GST. So perhaps if we can rationalize it, reduce the tax burden in terms of the indirect tax that he's talking about, then we'll see a more effective collection. And in terms of direct tax, I don't think anyone in this room would right now agree to more tax collection through direct tax, but that is a reality that faces us.
Okay, I'm going to end with Tuhin because he
I think the larger point that this conversation has highlighted that goes beyond just the immediacies of this budget is that we are at a very critical and crucial juncture that we do have to have there are fairly important dilemmas that our governance structure faces, which raise important questions about the nature of our federalism, which raise important questions about the nature of welfare state, and these are debates that we need to have that go beyond just the politics of the moment, because the choices we are making over these next few years are going to fundamentally alter the pathway for this country, and that needs a very, very careful, serious and informed conversation.
The budget, I thought there is a case for interim budget doing something, and that case has to be, here is something critical, 6 months are important. And since I'm in government, I cannot shirk the responsibility. Let me do a few things to address the 6 months. There were two real big questions of that kind. One was farmers' crisis, agriculture crisis. Second is unemployment. And what really disappointed me in yesterday's presentation was that there was not even an acknowledgement of the fact that there is a crisis on the employment front. That's one of the deepest disappointments. I mean, you don't even begin. And yesterday in the debates, when many of your colleagues participated in debates, all of them came up with two arguments which were so ridiculous. One is to say, oh, we have growth. It cannot be that employment is not growing. I said there is something called jobless growth. This is a phenomenon which is known all over the world. So, I mean, unless you even recognize them, there used to be a South African president who said AIDS doesn't exist. So if you think AIDS doesn't exist, how are you going to solve it? We seem to be in a similar position. We seem to be assuming that since economy is growing, jobs must be growing. That's a very serious problem. And the second argument that they came up with, and I'm very sad that Mr. Arun Jaitley actually wrote it down. He said, unless we have protests on the street, we must assume that employment must be all right. That's the essence of what he said yesterday. I mean, these are very dangerous arguments to use, very irresponsible arguments to use. That's on the economy, on the unemployment front. On the agriculture front, some urgent things actually needed to be done. One was on the what might look to be a small problem, but if you travel in rural India, it is epidemic right now. Stray cattle problem. Something needs to be done. Farmers are sort of up in arms. School mein janvaron ko bandh rahe hain. They are doing whatever they can do right now. Something needed to be done to. I mean, you don't need a Kamdhenu commission. That can be done next year. I actually do not have any problem with government paying greater attention to protection of cows. I think that should be a national policy. I don't mind that at all. But they also pay some attention to someone who's keeping all these cows. There's zero attention to that. This is what really troubled me. But I'll end with one positive note. Whatever happened yesterday, whatever the BJP announced, merits, demerits, we've condemned it, all that is done. One positive unintended consequence. So far, agriculture budget used to be 2.2% of the Indian Union budget. Yesterday, it jumped to 5.5%. And no government in this country will have the guts now to bring it back. That is positive.
Yogendra would know better that when we go into television debates, it's and Priyanka ji would also know, it's a mix of real facts and rhetoric. So there are times when, depending upon the individual spokesperson, rhetoric precedes data, and sometimes it's vice versa. You know, I would be in denial if I said the employment situation is all hunky-dory and it's all, you know, I would be in a utopian world if I said that. But having said that, in a country of the size of India, you know, it may take a few more decades before the problem is completely solved. Now, some quick data before I agree that is a problem, but it is also exaggerated to the level that it is not. Now, when you compare the two 5-year periods, 2009 to 14 and 2014 to 2018, you would agree that the GDP, the total GDP has grown between the two, you know, the growth that was there between 2009 to 2014, it has grown 28% more than what it was growing between 2009 to 2014. So, unemployment of the scale which is being told does not fit into this level of GDP growth. Number two, there have been some 18 million formal jobs generated and taken up in only the transport and the professional sectors. Number three, you know, look at the infrastructure sectors. When you talk about per day road construction of 11 kilometers per day, and you contrast it with 27 kilometers per day, there is no evidence yet of robots constructing those roads or artificial intelligence being exclusively employed to, you know, have that construction done. So obviously there is employment over there. But globally, the nature of jobs have changed, and that's a reality. Now there is employment, there is entrepreneurship. Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana has given 13 crore recipients has 13 crore recipients. Now, even if I were to assume that only 1/3 of them are first-time loan seekers, either for expansion of business or for setting up a new business, imagine even if each one of them generates 2 or 3 employees, imagine the employment which has been generated.
No, they can't, because 89% of them have an average of 24,000 rupees.
So UPA had a different way of calculating figures, we have a different way of calculating figures. But the fact is,
This is government figures, Saubhagya figures.
so
Listen, you have a report. You could give us the numbers. There is
that
an
is an
NSSO
unverified,
report.
that is an unverified
Oh, no,
report.
I'm
We
sorry.
verify and
You
give
are,
it to you.
a government cannot
We verify,
verify an NSO report.
we will-
NSSO reports are verified by the Statistical Commission, and it were verified. You are not the person to verify a commission. No government, no Prime Minister, no Rajiv Kumar can verify an NSSO report. An NSSO report has got to be verified by the Statistical Commission. It was done. You suppressed it. Now, why? If you're so conscious of all these jobs, give us the report.
See, I didn't start by saying it's a hunky-dory situation, okay? But
No,
the
but
fact is...
The point is, you need to know it yourselves for your
I think
own policies.
Professor Ghosh, one has to give it to Toheen that he, given the situation, he has admitted that there is something. I mean, he represents a political
No, but
party.
when
He can't
you
really.
respond the way you did, then I would also be forced to say that, if you actually project unemployment to the level that you do, despite all of opposition's attempts to manufacture that, why has the similar level of protest not taken place? I am forced to respond to it the way if you provoke me with these.
Okay, so
I just want to
protesting out
inform the
large
audience.
numbers, there are no rapes happening in this country. So this is what the idea is. Oh, if there are no jobs and there's no civil unrest, means everyone has a job. That's your argument.
When did that happen?
By the way, I just want to tell the audience that on the 7th of March, there is a very large national protest by the youth and the students coming from all over the country. Anyone interested can join. It's on the 7th of March from Ramlila ground to the Parliament.
Okay, I think that let's just throw it open to.
I'll try to extend moral support.
I am Mahipal, and I have been the rural development practitioner, and I have visited more than 400 villages in UP, Rajasthan and elsewhere. And I found one thing, that the people's engagement in development is not taking place. Yes, there is institutional mechanisms are there, panchayats are there, committees are there, so many things are there, but that has not been taking place. Professor Chakravarti said about central state resources and responsibility, but I think more responsibility at the panchayat level. 29 items are there. They are supposed to prepare the plan for economic development and social justice. But what is happening? That is not taking place. The reason is that at the local level, that the administrative support is lacking, as Yamini pointed out. Now, there is no official there is no support mechanism to the elected representatives. So, that is creating a problem at local level. Now, this 6,000 rupees to be transferred to the small marginal farmers. Then again the problem arises when the local level official would not be there. How would we be able to transfer there?
Okay.
That is the issue. But this issue could be tackled by the one committee called BOS committee. They talked about that, let us reorganize the panchayat at the viable level. And these officials, the deficiencies are there. That could be make up through other civil society organizations, convergence, some other trusted NGOs working, their officials, and some in that way that could be tackled. But my concern is that the local rural governance would be effective. That's why all these things we have been talking about would be translated into action, and they will be reached to the people, and they will be engaged in development process of the country.
All right.
Thank you.
That's a good point.
I'm Ayush. I'm a student of public policy at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. Professor Ghosh mentioned initially about the budget constraints with a demand-driven program like Manrega. And according to data, in the past 3-4 years, there have been at least pending liabilities ranging from 30% to 50%. And that has a dampening effect on the farmers because they have to wait for 2 to 3 years for their wages, and that discourages them. So I would just request the panel to discuss the consequences.
Would you like to address your question to someone specific? Because otherwise, once you let us speak,
Sure.
we'll
Could be the budgetary measures which could be adopted to solve the problem.
All right. Let's start with.
To say once the jobs have been demanded, they have to be provided. What has been happening is that the centre has put a budget limit, and then when its budget limit is over, it doesn't provide more money to the states. So the way to resolve it is very simple, which is that the centre must provide. There have been situations where Chief Minister has to come and sit in dharna at Jantar Mantar to get the money for Narega. It's actually an obscene way that the central government has actually tried to inhibit money. In terms of the implications, you're absolutely right that it has very serious implications because it not only denies workers, then they get disheartened and they don't come for work and so on. But this is a drought situation now in 8 states, and it's spreading, and it's very, very serious. If you do not put works in place now, we are going to have really extreme rural distress. So I have traveled in Maharashtra and Telangana and Andhra Pradesh very recently in this month, and I have found that in fact across the area there is a huge demand for work, which cannot be met because money is simply not coming from the central government. So you're absolutely right.
I've been, in fact, I would assume that in a time of deep rural distress, you already have some structure and system in place. The most obvious and sensible, in my opinion, thing to do is to be able to utilize that system better, right? So if it was my budget, I think what I would have done was to have significantly enhanced NREGA to ensure that we solved that problem along with whatever else we did. But of course, that has not happened. And what particularly puzzles me in this conversation about a minimum basic income is precisely this, that if you already have a National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in place, which at one level is about putting more cash for work, why are we not talking about strengthening and enhancing that? Why, on the other hand, are we talking about introducing something new? Now, one part of that goes back to the dilemma that Yogendraji talked about, which is the dilemma of implementation, the dilemma of a broken governance system, the dilemma of broken administration, weak state. One of the important advantages of a NREGA scheme over a basic income scheme was the attempt to introduce an asset creation component, right? That was supposed to be. Now, the inability to implement that well, and of course there are cases where it has been implemented very well, but there are also significant places where that hasn't been the focus. I think that has also created more credence to the notion that these large, leaky welfare schemes